Hello, everyone. Welcome to another exciting episode of the DevLogue Podcast, where we dive deep into everything related to software development. Our focus is on learning and exploring how to improve our processes, particularly through leveraging AI and data-driven strategies. I'm your host, Henry, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Amo. How are you doing, Amo?
Hey, Henry, I'm doing great. Thanks. I'm super excited for yet another episode of our DevLogue podcast.
And today we have a special guest who's also a longtime friend of us, Jim Lesko. So Jim is a VP of engineering with over 20 years of experience in growing engineering teams, driving innovation, and optimizing processes. So Jim has led the engineering organization at a number of successful startups, including ClearStory, Dentist, Study.com, to name a few. So Jim Lesko, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So Jim, can you start by telling us a bit about yourself and your journey from engineer to a senior engineering leader across a variety of successful early stage tech startups?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as you kind of mentioned, a lot of the companies that I've been with have been, or at least have started on the relatively small side. But in my career, I started as a software developer, senior software developer, variety of other titles along the way on the technical side, including software architect. And really, in retrospect, what I found myself doing, in addition to doing whatever product development work I had done, is looking for tools and developing tools. Honestly, there weren't as many back then, so you actually had to, roll up your sleeves and do some of that work yourself. That would give you fast feedback. And so, honestly, a lot of that for me was just making sure that other people didn't see the bugs I was writing, but then ultimately rolled them out for the team, rolled them out for the department. And so that was really great, and got that kind of fast feedback cycle going. Then as I moved to team lead and kind of, long time ago now, exposed to Scrum and Agile, got more involved in the process side of things and the people side of things. And there it actually became part of also getting fast feedback, right? And so I found myself, for instance, tracking. I mean, you do this kind of as part of Scrum typically anyways, as it comes along with it, is like, what's your velocity? And working with the team to figure out what process works best. Kind of an interesting story from that time is I was working with the team that we did ideal hours, not story points at the time, but you can, whatever metric you want to use. And I actually tracked a whole year worth of data and consistent actuals versus estimates and compared them. And so took meticulous notes, got the data and everything. This is all in a spreadsheet. So it was, all done by hand. Took a lot of time. But it turned out that they consistently overestimated the amount of work that they were going to be able to do by 25% consistently. And then I showed that after a year, right? I held it from, I just wanted to see how it goes, kind of running an experiment. And so I actually showed it to them and we discussed it, right? And they're like, oh, that's interesting. And we should take this into account, et cetera, et cetera. And then you keep tracking the metrics afterwards. And they still consistently overcommitted by 25%. It was interesting to see. But the thing I took away was the psychology aspect of it, right? The people aspect of it. You can have the process, you can have the tools, you can have everything, but people still are people. And the importance of data collection, right? Is, had I thought, just went, okay, we talked about this, now they're going to get better. It didn't change really, but everyone would have thought that it did, I think, because they were thinking about it, right? And they had that feedback loop. But then if you didn't track it afterwards, there's, you got that feedback. So that was pretty cool. And then for the last, 10 years or so, being more in a management role, went over to the dark side. I know not a lot of engineers want to go into the people and the process. They want to stay heads down coding, and that's cool. I love the technology aspect as well, but that process piece, that tooling piece, kind of drew me in, and I wasn't as put off by it maybe as some. And so I went that direction. And so really now when I work with teams, in addition to trying to cultivate the next generation of leaders in my teams, really what I try to do comes down to three principles: fast feedback, transparency, and predictability.
Awesome. So Jim, we talk a lot about Spring predictability when we set up metrics in DevLake for your team. So I wonder, how do you define, sprint predictability in your teams? And then why is it a critical factor for success?
Yeah. It was interesting because it wasn't originally something that kind of I paid a lot of attention to because, I was kind of had a developer mindset, like we're going to get done what we get done. But again, when you think about the way people think about things and the mindset, really, the way I look at predictability, and there's a lot of different ways to, you could talk about, long-term planning, short-term planning, that sort of thing. Really, the figure that I'm looking at for predictability is how much of the work that was planned for the team is being delivered and completely done by the end of the sprint or whatever iteration you're using at the end, right? So if you said you were going to work on 12 items and you only got, 6 items done, then I'd call that 50% predictability. So there's no complicated math here. It's simply how much did you say you were going to get done and how much did you actually get done? And why it's critical is oftentimes I've seen at companies the kind of the business side not understanding how the product development process works from a software perspective and all the bits and pieces that go into it, and certainly not looking at it as a system. They don't want to. They want to have confidence that when someone says they're going to get something done, that it'll get done, rightfully so, right? And I think we've all been there, where it's like, oh, I'm going to get it done tomorrow, and then next thing you know, it's taken a week, and you can explain why it did. Well, they updated the compiler, I had dependencies, other things came in, etc. But if you want to hit that predictability, you want to build that confidence, and there are ways to make sure that you can actually get that done, and it changes a mindset when you're able to reach higher levels of predictability.
Is there an ideal number for sprint predictability, like 100% or 90%? Like, how do you differentiate between teams consistently hitting over 90% versus teams maybe hitting 40, 50?
Yeah. I mean, it's not uncommon. Oftentimes when I come in, teams are at 40, 50%, really low, kind of double-digit levels of predictability. And really have to think about, what does that mean, right? That means they're delivering half of what they said they were going to get done. A lot of reasons this could be, but in the end, what kind of the implication of that to me is that you have sprint rollover, right? And so let's say you've had 80 points planned and you deliver 40 points, and then you start planning for the next sprint. And I've seen this a few times where everyone's like, well, but the 40 points that we pulled over from the other sprint, they're almost done. So we can get 80 points done this sprint, definitely, right? But when you see that over and over, I don't think I've ever seen a time when a team actually kind of caught up and delivered last sprint's work plus this sprint's work, right? But it's something that I don't know exactly what it is from a psychological perspective, but we all kind of get into this, right? We want it to happen. We want to hit our goals. We want to ship product. We want a successful business, right? That's what we get paid to do as developers. And so what you get when you're going to 90% predictability or more, you're asking if there was a kind of a solid number to hit. 100% is the ideal, but if you're hitting 100% consistently, then you're cooking the books in some way, shape, or form. Honestly, I mean, well, because it's like you're hiding work. I've actually seen teams do this, right, where they kind of, well, we also did this other work, but we didn't include it in whatever tool we were using because we wanted to hit 100% predictability, right? Or it's not quite done, but they kind of fudge the definition of done, right, for that item, or they just sandbag, right? And it's like, oh, we can do 40 points this sprint. I'm going to do 30. And then we always look good or whatever, anyways. So really what you're looking for, if you see 100% predictability sprint over sprint, it's time to ask some different questions. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but you want to dig in. Really the range that I'm looking for is typically 90% to 110%, right? Things happen. Things are more complicated, less complicated. Someone's out, for a family emergency for a day or two, right? These things happen. And if they're happening, and again, if you're getting 100% predictability, like, well, everyone just stepped up all the, So, and any time that you miss, there can be a miss of 60, 70% or something like that from time to time. What you're looking at is the pattern. And so if you're in a team that has 100% predictability, give or take, right? Within a 10%, 15% range, whatever it is. Really depends on what scale of numbers you're looking at. But then the team is now delivering what they say they're going to deliver. And moreover, there's typically very little rollover from sprint to sprint. And it's easy to say, but when you see teams actually do this, it's the different, you see them start to maybe pay a little bit more attention in planning, right? Because the things now that you're discussing in planning are the things you're going to get done in that sprint. Not because a manager told you to, or we had to rally and get it done, but because the team knows that what they pick actually gets done within the sprint. And it's an important piece of this actually is making sure, anyone could plan the sprint for them, for instance, but it's usually best if the team is the one drawing in the work, right? And so it's a system. You can't just change one aspect of it. But really, once they start to see, and then stakeholders start to notice that, I asked if it was going to get done, and they said at the end of the sprint, and they got it done at the end of the sprint. Whereas when you're kind of then planning 80 but delivering 40 scenario, hopefully that 40 points will wrap up. But then someone wraps up and the rest of the team doesn't, et cetera, and they pick something from the kind of the undone work. But you don't know necessarily what that one thing is going to be. So is it going to get done this sprint? Is it going to get done next sprint? Is it going to get done the sprint after that? Again, it's a lack of predictability in a few different ways. But if you say you're going to get 40 points done and you deliver 40 points, and I'm just using that as an example, but then they know that they're going to deliver it. All of a sudden, what they take into sprint planning matters, and they have control over it. And then, if they're at 38 points, right, on like the last day of the sprint or something like that, you see them go the extra mile to kind of to push that forward, because then it becomes a matter of team pride. And again, part of this is also showing the predictability back to the team. If they don't know what their predictability is, or what then it's just observation, which has its place. But again, with team feedback, again, it comes down to fast feedback, right? Is the team knows how far along they are, what their predictability has been. One of the best things that can happen, or an early thing that can happen, is I'll have a one-on-one with somebody and I'll ask, how's the sprint going? And the team member knows what their predictability is or how far along they are. And they're like, we're only at 27% predictability, or they're talking about previous sprint, what have you. But they care and they know, and they'll tell you, and they'll be like, but it's because of this, right? And they're kind of framing it for you already. They're thinking about it. And that's a great thing to have happen, is not just being monitoring by like the managers, but giving that number back to the team, and it becomes a self-correcting cycle. A lot depends on the people on the team, but I've seen this again and again in teams, and once it starts to get traction, it's a virtuous cycle and leads to other things.
So Jim, a question for you. So predictability is an interesting one, right? Because it's really all about accuracy, or being able to plan. So for instance, with predictability, let's say you're planning on delivering the 40 story points in the sprint, right? But if you only deliver 20, obviously that's bad. You're at 50%. But the flip side of it is also true also. And you mentioned this, you want to be in that range of 90 to 110%. If you planned on delivering 40, but you delivered 80, you would think you would want to celebrate because you doubled the plan. But in reality, that's a bad predictability metric, right? You're missing on predictability. So talk a little bit about that. Is that true? And what's the negative of going over like that? What's the negative of planning 40 but delivering 80? Is it because it's a sign of sandbagging that you need to address? Or talk about that a little bit if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen it happen, and sometimes there are good reasons why it happens, right? The work from the previous sprint really was almost done. Like we waited to deploy it for a reason or something like that. And maybe there was a member of another team that got to deploy it, and the team got to focus on, it's a system though, right? And you want to look at trends. If that happens once a quarter, maybe, then yeah, celebrate, right? The team got more done than they committed for whatever reason. It all went really well, and that's fantastic. But if you see it happen again and again, then it's a sign that the team doesn't know how to plan, right? They don't know because they're not actually delivering what they said they were going to deliver. They're delivering more. And then the question becomes, Well, it's coming at what expense? Is it sandbagging? It might be, right? I mean, under commit and over deliver, right? That's not a bad thing. But where is that other? Let's say you're doing, you commit to 20 and you deliver 40. Where did that other 20 points worth of work come from? How well was it designed? Was it work that it wasn't work that the team planned, right? That's the important piece. Is it's not work that the team planned. And now maybe as part of the team culture, I can envision a lot of different scenarios. Like the team culture is they get their work done for what they planned, and then they take in work from whatever else because it's interruptible. So, for instance, on like a platform team, or where you have a lot of interruptions and unplanned work, you might see something like this, right? Where there were fewer interruptions. Good thing you actually got delivered more work than was originally planned. But again, I wouldn't expect to see it consistently over time. I'd expect it to be just kind of a one-off every so often, something like that. So if you consistently see predictability above maybe 120%, 130%, something's going on, and you just need to plan more, because then it's unpredictable what it is that the team is actually doing in some systems.
Yeah. So how do you get your team to get better at planning and consistently over time? So improving predictability. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning you started gathering the metrics, right? And you started showing your teams that consistently over time, it's always 25%. You're delivering 25% less than what we planned we were going to deliver. And then you show them the metrics, you have the aha moment. But then in the future weeks or months, it was still 25% below, even after you adjusted. So how do you improve predictability where you're not just showing them the numbers? Now it's a moving target, right? Now the target is moving. How do you actually improve that metric and actually get better at planning and then delivering against that plan?
I think a lot of it comes down to the math, honestly, is looking at the past. I mean, this is kind of Scrum 101 stuff, and you'll see it in Sutherland's book, and yesterday's weather is the idea, right? Is if consistently over time, and especially I think this works better with points than with ideal hours. And I could get into kind of the psychology of that. But really it comes down to tracking what the team has done and accommodating that. Honestly, when I get into a team that is at 30 or 40% predictability, like just from the get-go, there's this interesting conversation that I find needs to happen with stakeholders, but also the team, where there's some reason that is happening, right? That they're not at that level of deliverability. Of predictability. And so what you want to do is just take their average over time and maybe even shave off 10%. So you have a high likelihood that they're going to deliver, right? And then you can get there. And then you just start to, it varies over time, and you see how much they deliver, and it trends in some direction. You have a tool like Dev Insight, right, where you can actually look at it over time and, dig into the reasons and show it to the team, give the team access, things like that, again, for transparency and ultimately providing fast feedback. And so I think that's a large part of what it's about is just do the math, track the numbers, give it back to the team. Now, there's other things that come into it, like estimation. I find oftentimes when you have kind of varying predictability over time, oftentimes you'll see sawtooth. That can talk about, what was the CI/CD process like, or, testing process, quality of the code and quality of the code base can really impact that. If you deliver something, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of production issues, that's going to affect your predictability. And so there are definitely, again, as a system, there's a lot of places where interruptions can come from, where things that would affect predictability. But the important thing is to start with having them available to everybody so that they can all see it, and then bring it up on a I wouldn't bring it up during every stand-up maybe, but maybe during retrospectives, things like that.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting you said that. So quality, I guess, is the next logical topic, right, that we can go to in the conversation, because obviously it's important to go fast, right? We want to deploy to production more often than not so we can bring new features out to market. Predictability is a huge piece of that also, as we've been discussing, for the last several minutes here. But that last piece is quality, right? If you're going fast and you're good at predicting what you're going to accomplish in a particular sprint so you can plan better, but you're deploying low quality code, or you have too many incidents, obviously that's a bad thing, and that impacts predictability. That eventually impacts how fast you can go also. So what are some of your, when it comes to maintaining quality, right? How have you done this successfully in the teams that you've led? Like, again, what metrics do you rely on to make sure your team is on track from a quality perspective? Do you have any like challenges or any success stories that you've had with your teams on keeping quality in check as you're working on predictability and as you're working on speed?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I've stood up QA teams in a few different organizations or inherited QA teams. And the numbers you typically want to look at are, or at least I like to look at, and there's several of them, but if you just take a look at the number of bugs that are caught in production, and so working with your customer success team, SRE teams, tech support teams, whoever you have there that are taking customer reported issues or production issues and bring them into the teams. But then there's the pre-production environments, right? If you have a staging environment, if you have a development environment, your own local system, that sort of thing, how much can you catch, right? There's this whole, survey that I think was IBM did that, shows that the cost of a bug, right? If you catch it in the design phase, it's like one, whatever, as just kind of a baseline. And once it gets out to the customer, right, the overhead of fixing that, deploying it, getting into a sprint, all that other stuff that adds up makes it much more expensive to correct it there. So you always want to, you hear the phrase move it left. And I use that with my teams all the time because you want, again, get fast feedback. How do we get that information earlier? It's not always an easy thing to do. But if you're measuring how many pre-production issues you have and then post-production issues you have, one thing you could look for is trends over time, right? Are we shipping more bugs to production or fewer? If you're shipping fewer bugs to production, maybe you're catching them and you're seeing actually an increase in the issues caught in pre-production. So for instance, if you have a really good automated test suite or something like that, and you increase the number of cases, then all of a sudden you're catching more of them beforehand. And that's a good thing, right? You wouldn't want to see both the numbers pre-prod and production going up because that's a different story. And again, you'd want to ask and get in. That's where the transparency, fast feedback comes in. But once you have those metrics and trends, really, is you can make a change. You have to experiment. The assumption is that what you're doing isn't working in some way, shape, or form, or you'd be focused on something else, right? So you want to try something. And then once you've tried it, you can look to see what impact it had. So for instance, one of the changes that I recently made with a set of teams, was test cases. We had QA doing manual QA. And so they were writing the test cases during the sprint while the code was being developed, and things were getting done at roughly the same time. Sometimes there was a little unpredictability in terms of test cases not being ready for manual testing, and so that affected team predictability. So we talked about that. But also very early on when I joined this organization, what had happened was the developers were thinking, they had this kind of old school approach of, well, I do the coding and I get it to QA as fast as possible, and it's their job to test it and give me feedback. Now, they were doing unit tests and things like that. Thankfully, that has pervaded our industry, and it seems like everybody, does at least that level. But there were times when things were coming up and QA brought them up, and it's like, did you even test this? And you'd never want to hear that as a developer, is did you even test it, right? That should just not be something you heard. So we made a change. QA was going to be writing the test cases anyways, and we made it so that the development environment was always worked, always was potentially shippable. And then what we did was we kind of flipped it, and we made it so the test cases were written before the team even did estimation. So a whole different topic. The whole team estimating together. There are teams that everyone's like, how do we have QA and developers estimate together, right? It's a mind shift. It's okay. You have to meet the team where they're at and then build up from there. But they'd write the test cases in advance. And then during our development phase, the developers would be the ones who executed the test cases, right? And so now it wasn't just QA doing the testing, the developers were doing the testing. And then QA could execute those tests again, but the developers executed them, and hopefully you've got teams that if developers say that they've tested them and they passed, that they actually do pass. Otherwise, again, there's a different conversation, different feedback there. So now the QA, once they've written the test cases for the upcoming work, can now focus on things like exploratory testing, performance, right? All these other aspects of quality that might not have gotten attention before. So the interesting thing, and I am getting to a number here, real metrics, is because the developers were doing the testing and they were focused on it, right? And they had the conversations in advance. I can't, there are different facets of why this happened, but the initial change was moving test case writing to happen before estimation. Forget about before the work, before estimation. And the team reduced the number of those pre-production issues by 75%. So I think like one quarter it was 180 and it got down to like 45 or something like that. And so, I mean, when you look at the trend line, you see this drop, right? And it was not subtle. And even if you say, oh, well, the developers were writing the same number of issues, only they were finding them. They didn't log a bug, right, in whatever ticketing system when they had the issue because they just go back and fix it. But again, think of that, right? You're talking 130 some odd issues in Jira in our case, but that didn't need to have a summary, didn't need to have a description, didn't need to link to test cases, didn't need to link to PRDs or requirements doc, right? There's just the overhead of doing this work. And even if a 30-second fix for a developer, the difference in having the developer test it and have the problem in their head and then turn around and then retest it, right? And then get it to where that test case passes. Compare that to it gets, deployed. You've already gone through, PR maybe, and then QA tests it, right? And they've just got a long list of things that they're testing. And then they find something, they have to stop everything, right? Get out of the flow of testing. They have to write the thing down, document it, get it over to development. They probably, there's all this overhead that goes into it. Let's say it takes 10 minutes per item. You multiply that by 130, and you're talking real time saved by doing the thing that they were going to do anyways, which is writing test cases and just doing it earlier in the process. And again, by capturing that metric and tracking it and making it visible in a tool like DevInsight, right? You can see the number of these issues through labels or however you track them and identify them, right? And you see that it just goes right down to 25% of what it was. And I think that was just incredible. And again, yeah, I mean, it just the feedback loop and the changes that come along with that, like developers talking to QA in this case much more closely because they're like, oh, I have, just a lot of things came from that, but the most obvious artifact was the change in the trend line.
Yeah, I mean that's an incredible achievement. So I got to ask you, how did you get the developers to buy in? Because a lot of what you're talking about is really behavioral change, right? Them doing something different or changing their day-to-day operations and changing behavior different than what they had before. And so you talked a little bit about, meeting the team where they're at and kind of improving from there. But I'd love to hear kind of your specifics on how did you actually get them to change their behavior? How did you actually get them to affect change? Because all of these ideas are they sound simple, they sound easy to implement. Shift left, do testing earlier in the process, get developers to do their own testing. But then the actual implementation of all of this stuff is where the execution is where it falls short. So how did you get them to buy in, and how did you get them to do consistent behavioral change over time that produce these results?
Yeah, change is hard. And again, none of this is like, some revelation that I have from on high or something like that. The ray of light came from heaven and hit me. I mean, these are out there in books like Accelerate or any number of how-tos out there and have been known for some time. But teams don't always have access to that or know how to apply it, or maybe it's not applicable at some stage, and then they've grown, and then they didn't modify the process as they've come up. So yeah, change is hard. The way I approach it, I think I alluded to earlier, one thing I like to do is develop the next generation of leaders, and I go to the team. I know where I think I know what's worked in the past. I know, for me anyways, in the teams that I've worked with. But if I just go in and tell the team, then most of the time you'll get compliance, right? I'm doing this because Jim said I needed to do it. Rather, what you do is you want to kind of seek out who would be a champion for this, or what ideas does the team have. I mean, these teams, it's not like they said everything is working 100% fine. They're like, we need better, we need more acceptance criteria, or we need more time to plan, or and they'll tell you. I mean, just go in and ask the teams and they'll tell you what they think, Now, sometimes it's maybe addressing a symptom, not a root cause, or there's some aspect of it that, they get 80% right, and, but you've seen it work maybe a little bit differently. But then you can work with individuals, leaders within the team, even not necessarily managers, but informal leaders, right? They have informal influence, someone that really wants to just run with it or has, however they have influence. And then you want them to kind of socialize the idea within the team, get the word out, and then we can have a discussion. We can have a meeting with the team. One, if I can get the team talking about it without me ever bringing it up, that's what I like the best. And then I go, okay, we'll try it. Where inside I might be doing, a Snoopy dance. I'm like, yes. I had one team once, actually, their lead developer, their team lead, came to me and said, Jim, I know you don't want to do this thing, but we're going to do it anyways. And I was thinking, we talked about this a year ago, that this is exactly where we want it to go. But if you think it's your idea, this is my internal monologue, right? Is if you think it's your idea and you want to run with it, I mean, what better way to actually have it happen? Because it's their idea, they're invested in the success of it. They're gonna twist the arms of everybody. And by the way, they also managed to talk the manager into going along with it, right? So wow, let's really run with it. Now that's ideal, perhaps, in a lot of cases, but doesn't necessarily happen naturally, right? So then you have to look at, well, okay, then maybe you have the discussion. If you don't have a natural champion for some of these changes, which in the case actually in the team I worked with, and when we saw this, precipitous drop in the number of pre-production issues, I had people who were saying this, and to some extent, it was just a matter of me saying, go do it. And sometimes that meant just saying, in this case, writing test cases beforehand is going to mean we need to finish this sprint's test cases and write next sprint's test cases. And so you have to look for the time. As a manager, I can make that happen, right? I can say, look, for 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever it is, we're going to do something else. The developers, but the QA folk are going to write the test cases, et cetera, right? And then you had that window that's open. So the team wants to do it, they have the idea, but they can't make it happen, right? They can't just change their behavior because it would actually affect what they deliver in the sprint. So as a manager, I can make that happen, right? I can promote it, etc.
I think the idea of
really,
I think the idea of finding that battlefield general or that lieutenant or that player coach on your team that you can then align with and get that person to be an advocate for you, I think that's huge, because then it's not just you saying it, it's one of the team members that has influence or respect or persuasive abilities within the team, right? So you're able to indirectly affect change.
And either you set it up so that they can introduce the idea and run with it, or you bring up the idea and then you go, anyone have any comments? And then they back it up, right? And that signals to the team. They're like, hey, this is something that matters to us. It's not just some crazy idea that Jim read on a blog, or maybe it was, but then it turned out to be an idea that we wanted to try anyways, right? And then again, what you do is you make sure that you have the trends, you have some metrics, you have something like that, and then you show that back to the team.
I think one repeated theme I'm hearing from today's conversation is this, internal driving force versus external driving force. The external is more like James said it, I got to do it. Whereas internal is really this new practice is going to make all of our lives better. In the predictability case is, where we are actually hitting 90%, so people know we have control. And then people will actually care about the planning process because it's actually something that's going to affect, how the sprint is going to turn out. Also, like in the quality case is where we do more task-driven development, and then we'll have, last box logged, more time spent on actual features. So I think related to that, I just want to talk about, the developer satisfaction, right? How to keep developer motivated and then keep them, have this internal driving force instead of external ones. So what's your approach in terms of, keeping the developer satisfaction high? Is there any approach or frameworks that you recommend to, other engineering teams?
Yeah, I mean, you've got research out there now that shows that developer satisfaction correlates with better business outcomes. And I want to be careful to say that doesn't mean like developer happiness, right? We're not necessarily going to have back rubs for everybody or massages or something like that, or free those are good things and they may increase happiness. But with satisfaction, really, what I'm think of a synonym like engagement, for instance, right? Really, they are invested in the work. They find it. It's at the right level of challenge. They're honing their craft. They can really run with it and develop themselves as they're doing the work. And so when you have the satisfaction, when you have them engaged like that, you're gonna see those good outcomes. And no developer that I'm aware of that I've ever seen ever wants to ship bugs. They don't want to be woken up at 2:00 in the morning, on a page like, hey, the system's down, or high latency or what have you. And so that itself, like, what I think, again, the feedback loops are a big part of it, is having the feeling of control, right? In the case of predictability, if you're delivering close to 100% of what you've planned, you feel like you have more control than when you've got this phantom work that's out there that is you're never going to get to it, at least not this sprint, right? Or you can start to see that, hey, by the way, the number of pre-production defects is down. And so then you get that feedback, and then it's like, what else can I control? What else? Then the gears start to click. And similarly, from a kind of almost a team coach perspective, from a Scrum Master or a management perspective, I think an important aspect of the metrics that you want to collect is not just all the regular technical ones, but also survey the developers and ask, like, whether use NPS score or just some scale, and you go, this week, how satisfied are you? And you can phrase it in different ways, like, would you recommend this team to to a colleague that was thinking about joining, whatever it is. But then again, you start to see trends, and then you never want too many metrics, but if you have this satisfaction score and you can track it against number of defects or predictability, things like that, right? Then you can start to paint a more nuanced picture of how things are going in the team, right? Then if the number of defects is down, but team satisfaction is also down, well, what the heck is going on there? It's an opportunity to have a conversation, right? As a Scrum Master that I once worked with would say, maybe it's the team is putting in working weekends and putting in extra hours, and that's driving burnout, right? So they're getting fewer defects, which is good, but also their satisfaction is down. And so you can see, or maybe you put in a CI/CD system, you make releases easier, you can deploy fixes faster, that sort of thing. And maybe it's the same number of defects, but then satisfaction goes up, right? Because now they're like, oh, I don't have to spend an hour doing a release. It takes me 15 minutes, right? Something like that. And it doesn't interrupt their day as much. So really, there's a lot of, people are complicated. But they all have their own motivations, and that's a manager's job, is to kind of handle all that aspect of it. But again, collecting hard data and tracking it over time with something like that, you're going to see trends in satisfaction. I think what I've seen is satisfaction goes up, and other indicators that lead to better business outcomes also go up. So it's something to focus on, definitely.
And how do you track satisfaction, Jim? Again, do you go to the metrics, right? Not the quantitative metrics, but the qualitative ones through surveys? Or as a manager, do you have is it more about the relationships with your team, so that you know the team and you have the feeling about where they stand on satisfaction or happiness? Or is it kind of like a combination of both? The surveys give you the metrics, and then you also have the feelings because you're spending so much time with your team and you have those relationships. Like, how have you measured happiness or satisfaction in the past?
It's got to be both.
Mm-hmm.
You can, because there's, metrics can only tell you so much. Metrics and trends, I found, have been a good trigger for a conversation, right? And it doesn't tell you who to talk to necessarily, or what sometimes, honestly, I've just gone and like, look, things seem to have been going fine, but I noticed, predictability is down or up, or whatever. Like, what do you think is going on here, right? And that opens the door to a conversation, like, oh, is having a hard time, whatever it is. And you start to get the story. And then I think for me, what I tell everyone always is that having, I'm not judging good or bad. It can lead to different outcomes for the team. But with more information, I can make more informed decisions, right? I can communicate that. I can, let the business side know, for instance, that, we're going to have, we're going to be late, or we're going to ship, whatever it is. And so you have to have that open door. You have to have that communication. But the metrics being there gives you a foundation to start the conversation and something to focus on that is not, personal, right? It's about the work. It's about the trends. Let's talk about that.
Awesome. So use metrics and trends as the conversation starter, but definitely talk to our team, get the context, and then make fully informed decisions. as part of the process.
Or better yet, they look at the metrics and they have the conversations. And they come to you and say, "Hey, Jim, look what we did."
Even better.
Even better. That's where you try to get to with everybody.
Awesome. So I think this is a great place for us to wrap up today's episode. But before we go, we usually do have several lightning questions. Whenever you're ready.
The lightning round.
Let's do this. Do my stretches.
Right. Okay. So first one, what's your favorite dev tool that you cannot live without?
Dev tool, all of them. I don't know. My first thought is my brain. No, I guess in a very practical sense, Notepad++. I'm a longtime VI user, but having Notepad, I can't tell you the number of documents I have. I'm in meetings most of the time, so I'm taking a lot of notes. But instead of putting them in some really great format or whatever it is, I Notepad++, I'll have them there. And then, by the way, if I also have to grab some JSON and format it, right, it can format anything and do syntax highlighting and automate, simple macros and things like that. And I think it can be a good, just lightweight, multi-purpose tool just to get things done on the desktop.
Awesome. Second question, can you recommend a recent book or blog that you came across and found great?
Yeah, absolutely. Books really, to some extent, too numerous to count. I think there's a lot of great information out there. I think there's a lot of overlap in kind of restating some basic principles. But one book that I've really gotten a lot from recently is Leadership is Language from David Marquette. You might know him as the guy who wrote the book Turn the Ship Around. Right? It's the story from the submarine, and he's the captain, and he goes on and he doesn't know anything about that submarine, so he has to rely on the crew. But the crew is used to a top-down hierarchical, system, but that won't work if the captain doesn't know what he needs to tell the crew, right? Leadership as Language builds on that, right? In addition to just kind of maybe the process aspect of it, which is in kind of Turn the Ship Around. Leadership as Language is, when you're a leader and you want to, trying to get things done and set up a team environment that has psychological safety and trust and gets these things done. It's about language. What language do you use, right? And so Leadership as Language has tracks the story of the El Faro, which was a ship that ended up sinking in the Caribbean, maybe it was the Atlantic side, whatever. But because the captain had kind of a top-down approach and his people knew there was a problem and they needed to report it, but the way they approached it, because the way the captain said things, the captain gave the impression the decision had already been made. We're just going to power through it, right? We just need to work harder and what have you. And the crew, when trying to raise the issues, would have kind of this deferential tone of well, it'd be great if we could do this and that and the other thing. And I've actually found myself doing that in some situations where whoever I'm reporting to is we're going to do this, right? And it's well, even though that instead you should be going, no, look, we can't do this because X, Y, Z. So for instance, instead of saying, hey, do you guys all agree with this plan, right? That's a yes or no. You go things like, hey, I'd love to just kind of hear your ideas of where there's flaws in this plan, right? Or let's poke some holes in this plan and see. It achieves different things with kind of a similar question, but you're avoiding just getting buy-in and compliance, and you're actually getting engagement, right, and getting people thinking about it. So there's a lot more to the book. I'm oversimplifying it, but I think it really kind of I found it resonates with a lot of my management style.
Great. Leadership is Language.
Turn the ship around.
And Turn the Ship Around. That's I don't know. I think it's classic at this point, but I don't know. Maybe it's just the people I hang out with.
Last question. If you could only code in one language for the rest of your career, which one would it be?
The one I've known the longest? That's an interesting question. Honestly, I think it would have to be multi-purpose because it needs to get a lot of things done. And I think the kind of the most pervasive multi-purpose language out there is JavaScript. But I come from a strongly typed background. Right? I'm a Java programmer by trade, I like to say. And so I'd have to say TypeScript. Probably TypeScript is the way to go. You can do just about everything, yet you get the benefits of a little bit more of that structure to it.
Great. Well, thanks for the great conversation, Jim. It's been a pleasure hosting you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, Jim, it's great to see you, old friend. Had a blast on the episode. Yeah, so thanks for joining with us on a Friday.
Likewise.